to today's event at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature, which, as a result of restrictions to prevent the spread of that virus, has become a virtual online festival of literature. Thank you very much for joining us. We do hope that everything is well where you are. We are both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, well, at least to go on online. Now, more than a quarter of a century ago, this festival began with a passionate few Swindonians wanting it to. But when they went to the civic leaders with the idea, one of whom, by the way, had the Tsarish title of Head of Culture, they were rebuffed with the line, "It won't work here. Literature is too long a word for Swindon," they said. Well, since then, the Swindon Festival of Literature has thrived. It's had Booker Prize winners, poet laureates, professors of English, and many, many new and emerging writers, and all of them have been enjoyed by Swindonians and others. So that is why we are happy to have a long Latinate word used as a strong noun, by the way, not a weaker adjective. This is a festival of literature, not a literary festival. Topic for discussion there. To describe what we celebrate in Swindon in May. And that is also why we have invited today's guest author to talk on the role of literature today. Furthermore, to give another perspective, a European one, we have invited a guest co-interviewer from another country. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to guest co-interviewer, researcher in English at the University of Vienna, Manuela Wippenfürth, and today's guest author and speaker, memoirist, novelist, poet, librettist, dramatist, critic, and Vice President of the Royal Society of Literature, Blake Morrison. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we're delighted that you're able to take part in our festival, even if it's only online. And it's a pity we can't see you in Swindon, because Swindon in spring is very nice. Do either of you know Swindon? Have you any connection with Swindon?
I visited once or twice. I'm afraid that's about it.
I think for me, it's been some more. I came to Swindon in 2003 for the first time, and actually know Swindon as a very literary place. I worked at the festival as a festival helper for 10 years, which allowed me direct access to the green rooms with many interesting and inspiring people. And I'm very honored that today I could not only talk to Blake Morrison in his green room, our virtual green room, but actually here on stage on the role of literature, which is very dear to my heart in my research and in my practice. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, Blake, and thank you, Manuela. I'm glad you met interesting people at the Festival of Literature in Swindon. Okay, we better get to the topic in hand, literature. What have centuries of writing in the shape of poems, novels, plays, and essays, all neatly pigeonholed as literature, done for humankind? Can poetry and prose fiction be deemed useful? What is the role of literature today? A tiny topic there for you, Blake. Over to you.
A tiny topic indeed. Well, you've asked it, what has literature done? What can it do for us? Can it do anything? Can it change us, affect how we live, influence our politics, morality, our sense of common purpose, our individual well-being? I have wondered about this ever since reading W.H. Auden's poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats as a sixth former, because in that poem there's the line, "Poetry makes nothing happen," which was pretty discouraging news to me at a time when I just started to write poetry, if only to make myself feel less lonely, less unlucky in love, less alienated from the adult world. Poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making. Well, that sounded pretty limiting and self-indulgent, as if I might be wasting my time, which when I looked in the cold light of day at the poems I'd written excitedly the night before, well, that was all too easy to believe. Yet Auden's poem isn't quite so discouraging as I first thought. Poetry survives, he says a few lines later, as a way of happening, a mouth. So poetry makes nothing happen, and yet it's a way of happening nonetheless. Does Auden mean it has a social purpose, however indirect? Well, I certainly concluded as much from the way he ends the poem, where far from slighting poetry or literature generally, his last three stanzas affirm its power and call on poets to use it for the greater good of humankind. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Let the healing fountain start. I think my notion of literature as a form of healing began back then when I first read that poem. And though I've had my doubts over the years and sometimes wonder whether I'm seduced by this idea of literature as healing because my parents were both doctors and I feel guilty at not following in their footsteps, nonetheless, I continue to believe in literature as a force for good, as an art form that can persuade us to rejoice or take comfort. It can teach us stuff, not least what empathy is, can improve our mental health, and even inform our moral values, and to the benefit of others as well as ourselves. Now, if you've read Ian McEwan's novel Saturday, you'll know that there's a scene in it where poetry does very decisively make something happen. The scene takes place in the house of the brain surgeon, Henry Perowne, who earlier that day, and the day is the 15th of February 2003, when a famous march took place against the war in Iraq, when this man Perowne has an altercation with someone called Baxter, whose car he's accidentally bumped into. The row doesn't work out, and cheated of reparation, Baxter has followed Perowne back to his family home, along with two thuggish accomplices, and is now threatening mayhem. He's already broken Henry's father's nose and made his daughter Daisy undress. Rape and murder are in the offing. Then Baxter spots the proof copy of a collection of poems that Daisy has written, and he asks her to read one. The sea is calm tonight, she begins. The tide is full. The moon lies fair. It's Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, that she's reciting. It's not one of her own poems, but Baxter doesn't know that, and her reading completely disarms him. It's beautiful, he says. His mood changes. The sense of menace disappeared. Thanks to literature and its power to affect mood and motivation, to calm, like the sea, the would-be rapist and murderer backs down. Now, I've got friends, poets included, who think that scene is ridiculous, as if reading a poem could prevent a rape, as if making burglars read Middlemarch could make them turn straight, as if a man would never murder his wife if he'd seen a performance of Othello. And yes, perhaps that scene does sit a little oddly in what's otherwise a social realist novel. I think it's there more as a kind of allegory about the potentially civilizing effects of culture. Thanks to a poem, Baxter is deterred from violence, and by implication, if only the British government under Tony Blair that day could have done the same by listening to the millions protesting, or if indeed they'd remembered Matthew Arnold's poem and its final line about the futility of going to war where ignorant armies clash by night. Has a poem ever prevented war? Maybe not. Indeed, poetry has sometimes encouraged war, either by glorifying battle scenes or by stirring bellicose nationalism. But the poets of the First World War, notably Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, bearing witness to from the trenches to the pity of war, they, I think, have created many a pacifist since. And in the West, at least, I think the romanticizing of war, so prevalent in 1914, is impossible to imagine now or ever again. By the same token, the liberalizing forces of the present day, that's to say, opposition to misogyny, homophobia, racism, social inequality, and violation of the natural world, I think many of that tendency has been nurtured by literature, and that it's always been the case that writers are often the ones to get there first, then readers, or readers at the same time, readers of the same mind, and last, usually last, yes, our lawmakers and politicians. Of course, to writers struggling at their desks, it often doesn't seem that way at all. Most of the time we feel powerless and insignificant and think Shelley's line about poets as unacknowledged legislators is way too grandiose. But Shelley had a point. He holds out the promise that writing can, in however modest a way, make good things come to pass. And I hang on to his positivity. I mean, not every book I've written has set out to change minds and hearts, but a few of them have. My memoir of my father tried to demystify illness and death by staring them honestly in the face. A long poem I wrote, The Ballad of the Yorkshire Ripper, reinterprets Peter Sutcliffe not as a psychopath, but more troublingly as a project. As a product of misogyny. And my book about the murder of James Bulger by two 10-year-olds questions whether it's right to judge and demonize children as if they were adults. So I felt in those books in a way to be going against the grain and trying to raise questions. The books date back to the 80s and the 90s, and on good days, I think our culture has moved on since then. On bad days, I fear it's stuck where it was. And of course, a writer can only do so much. It's politicians who are the acknowledged legislators. Politicians. I hate to mention them, especially just now. If our own government has failed so badly over COVID in every respect, but for the vaccination program, maybe it's not just because they're Tories or have a terrible leader or work according to the principles of a chumocracy. Maybe it's because they don't read books. Okay, they're busy people. But Nicola Sturgeon seems to have time to read fiction. And in England, once upon a time, people involved in politics not only read, but wrote. From Marvell and Dryden to Disraeli, Winston Churchill, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, remember. More recently, Barack Obama published an excellent memoir years before becoming president. Elsewhere, Václav Havel and Mario Vargas Llosa had political as well as literary careers. Indeed, it's arguable that Havel's plays and essays helped bring down the Berlin Wall, just as Seamus Heaney's poetry, I think, played some part in making the Good Friday Agreement possible, in easing tensions and bringing sides together. In large parts of the world, poetry is synonymous with protest and social reform, a way of happening, a mouth. So literature does, I think, have a role in bringing about social and political change, but perhaps its effects are more quantifiable at a micro level in its impact on individual lives. What impacts on Baxter in Ian McEwan's novel, as he hears Matthew Arnold's poem being read, isn't just its beauty, but that it reminds him of where he grew up. And that sense of recognition we get from literature, of a hand reaching out to take ours, is one of its great assets. I experience it especially with life writing and confessional poetry, where the author offers up personal experience. They open their heart, they share what they've been through in an intimate way, and doing so not from narcissism, but in a spirit of truth-telling, of needing to get the story told and making us as readers part of it, which if the story is told well enough, we're very happy to do because we understand and we empathize and we welcome the sincerity. Now, most authors hate to hear the word therapy used about what they do, but not me. I think therapy or catharsis can be part of what literature offers to author and reader alike. Of course, literature does many other things as well. It can stretch and intrigue and mystify us in pleasurable ways. I confess to being baffled by Kazuo Ishiguro's latest novel, Clara and the Sun, just as I was baffled by T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland when I read it in school. But I was happy to follow where Eliot took me, and now I'm happy to think about where Ishiguro's taken me. I'll go on thinking about his novel, and if I don't come up with an answer, well, that's fine too. I'm intrigued, I'm held, and I feel to be part of a process of discovery. And that's a key part, I think, of both writing and reading. I never set out to write a book knowing what I'm going to say. I only discover what I want to say in the process. And it's the same when I read. And there's a special thrill when something emerges that I wasn't expecting, that ambushes or even shocks me or in some way alters my mindset. So where does literature go from here? Where do we go after the year we've had? Every generation seems to think it's unique in living through unprecedented times. Even in the pre-industrial age, when things move more slowly, people talk nostalgically about how things used to be. There's always change, and in that sense, nothing ever changes. History is always happening. Still, it's fair to say the last year has seen the biggest change in my lifetime, when in one sense we felt to be living outside history because we went into lockdown and time seemed to stop. And yet, on the other hand, every day brought more news, different crises, reports of death on the front line, as if we were living through a war with the compensatory wartime effect of people pulling together, making more effort towards each other. And I think the literature of the next few years is bound to reflect this, like it or not. Not necessarily with novels and memoirs and poetry collections directly about COVID, though there will be plenty of those, and Michael Rosen, for one, has already got there. But no, I think more with, let's say, a less head-on response to what we've lived through. Something about the shock, the trauma that's gone with it, how so much we took for granted has gone, how the definition of what's normal, or what we took to be normal, has changed. The way we receive or consume literature has already changed, of course. For many, reading is something to be done on smartphones or tablets or laptops or Kindles. But the printed book still has its place. Sales of ebooks and audiobooks went up during the pandemic, but so did sales of print books, reaching an 8-year high. So when readers went online, it wasn't always to read, but to order books, hard copies, paperbacks. And doubtless we all do it for different reasons. To escape at a time when we were stuck at home and couldn't have holidays. To learn stuff at a time when places of education weren't operating at full capacity. And also crucially for comfort, to relieve depression or confusion or distress. It's what happens during a crisis. Just as sales of poetry went up during the 2 world wars of the 20th century, so sales of literature generally went up in the 2020 pandemic. If a way to the better there be, Thomas Hardy said, it exacts a full look at the worst. And if the literature of the next few years is downbeat, if it takes us to dark places, that doesn't mean its effect on us will be lowering. We look to literature as a way of accessing truth, not facts, but emotional truth, the kind of truth that doesn't make the headlines, the news that stays news. And when literature brings us that, it's a solace. We feel less alone. We feel comforted to know there are others feeling and thinking the same. Or we learn about others whose experiences aren't ours, but who make those experiences intelligible. So there's our capacity for fellow feeling, our openness to others is expanded. Literature brings words where there had been no words before, or it brings new words that make more sense than the old words did. It articulates what it means to be human in a way that painting or dance or sculpture or music can't, not because they aren't equally potent art forms, but because literature uses the language of our common currency. It's how we communicate with each other in daily life. And literature exploits that, no matter how heightened its language may be. So in dark times, and these are slightly brighter times, I'm pleased to say, I go on believing in literature, knowing that it has informed and broadened my understanding of life, the world, of other people, of myself, and it'll do the same for future generations. And not only broaden and inform, change. Because however modest its operations, however subtle its impact, poetry, literature in general, does make things happen. And those who live in the valley of its making are enlarged and heartened by its very existence. Thank you.
Blake, I'm clapping. Thank you very. I'm clapping with your most recent book. I'm using it to clap. Thank you very much. Reading and writing is a process of discovery. Literature makes us feel less alone. Literature brings new words and new meanings to life, etc., etc. I love it. And before Manuela asks her first question, I'd like to ask you a question that often comes up both in families and schools and elsewhere. And that is because in order to experience literature, one has to read. And that is the line, as long as they're reading something, as long as they read anything, that's all right. Do you think it's all right as long as they're reading anything?
Yeah, in short, I mean, I remember my younger son learning to read because of his interest in football and, you know, reading the back pages of the newspaper, and he then progressed to Harry Potter and so on. Yeah, so of course I would love the reading to be of high literature. Of course, I can't help having prejudice about what's more useful and inspiring to read, but I think so long as the habit of reading is there, that possibility is always open.
Thank you very much. A teacher I know says it's habits that we should form as teachers. All this stuff about inspiring children, they're already inspired. Just develop lots of good habits. Manuela, what did you think of what Blake said?
Well, I'm very amazed how poetic your talk was in its sense. You know that I come from a German-speaking background, so in German, poetry translates as Gedichte, so making it very dense what we want to say. And I found your presentation ever so dense, which was great. And also a broad perspective. I got hooked with the word of healing. And if we look at the history of the word of healing, it has that wholeness, becoming whole again, and connecting with us and with life and with other people. And I think we all agree that we wish that for many people, but many people, I think, feel pretty intimidated. You said there is high literature and we wish to read that. What do you say to people who feel intimidated by that idea of high literature? How do they gain an access to it?
That's a good question, Manuel, but also a difficult one to answer. You know, it's of course terrible that people should be intimidated by literature, because what's frightening about a book? And you know, so often in the past, I've met students, older students, really my generation, who have been scared of poetry, particularly because of the way they were taught it in school. I think things are a lot better these days. I think the kind of, from what I know of teachers in primary schools and the texts they're using, children can see the fun there is in poetry, that it isn't scary, that it's, you know, enjoyable. And so my hope is that, you know, we've got through that bad and sometimes rather snobbish period in the way that literature was taught and thought about.
That's such an interesting question, this point about, is it scary? Why is there something about literature that can be slightly off-putting to people? And I had an experience after one year's literature festival where I was buying cheap lager, and two people came towards me at the till with scars and with tattoos and pointed at me and said, "You're the literature bloke, ain't you?" And I thought they were going to assault me. And I acknowledged that I was. And they said, "We just want to tell you, mate, we come to your thing up at the Arts Centre, and all you do in there is talk about sex, death, life, and relationships like we do down in the pub. Only you do it in an organized way, mate. Keep it up, mate. Cheers, we'll be back." And they walked off. And I thought, literature, sex, death, life, and relationships done in an organized way. And the point I want to make is they loved it. They actually loved it. So there is a way in, isn't there?
There is a way in, and of course, your excellent Festival of Literature, not a literary festival. A festival of literature is one way. Maybe you've chosen that title very deliberately because it's less scary. Yes, and I think that as it seeps out into the wider culture with, I don't know, book groups as well as festivals. I wish there was more in the media on literature. I mean, we still lack a really good books program on television. From time to time, we've had it. But I think, honestly, people are less scared than they used to be. And accessibility is greater than it used to be.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the reason for sticking with the word literature is that I don't think it's right to dumb down. I think it's not right to patronize people and say, who will make it all something or other, some friendly in some way that is like a lure. Let them see it for what it is. John Carey, the emeritus professor of English at Oxford, came and talked about his book, My Life in Books. And afterwards, a young mechanic came up to me and said his girlfriend had brought him to the event. And he had a t-shirt on, he had dirt under his fingernails, and he said, "That was amazing what that bloke said, how much he loved books and how much they meant to him." He said, and this mechanic said to me, "I've never read a book. Can you tell me one? Can you recommend one?" And if you're interested, I recommended Holes by Louis Sachar. And I hear that he's subsequently reading. He's reading as a result of coming and listening to an emeritus professor.
That's a great story. And I have had the experience of, because some of the writing I've done has been about family. I've written about my father and my mother. And I've had readers come along, dragged along by a friend, a girlfriend, whatever. And for them, it's been amazing that, books, literature could be about ordinary families and the stuff that goes on in families. And they are grateful to discover that.
No, it links up to daily life. Manuela.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested. I've tried to discover with my students in 2 courses of how we can actually do literary learning with the help of social media and digital media. And when I try to give my students a more open and broader access to literature, I let literature do the trick. And it was a very simple activity that made the trick, I have to admit, that I asked them to keep a journal for a week and observe creative language use and what they considered as an aesthetic use of language. And they realized that, for example, Twitter and Instagram were filled with creative use of language and how much thought is actually put into language. And if we kind of downtone the idea of literature with a capital L to a creative and possibly conscious use of language, I think there's actually a lot to discover in our surroundings, and not only in books, but we're surrounded by it. And I think if we realize how much poetry and creative language does already in our day-to-day life, there's a lot to discover. I'd be interested in your view on that, and if you feel that social media for you as a writer or for your writing students in your creative writing classes has changed anything.
Well, I suppose it's changed me in that I hear people, especially my generation, saying, "Oh, these young people today, they don't read books. They spend all their time on their smartphones, and they're not literate as we used to be, and that we had less competition from other forms of media and that's one of the reasons we turn to books more." However, I mean, it strikes me, one thing that always strikes me is how literate and how literary many young people are. I mean, they're using keypads, keyboards, rather than learning to type like I did in my 20s. From an earlier age, they're communicating with each other in as it were, on keyboards, not just speaking. You know, they're writing, and some of that writing is creative, and there's a huge amount of self-expression going on. However reduced it might be, it's self-expression. I mean, the constraint actually of Twitter, of course, you know, you can compare to poetry. So yeah, I think they're a more literary and literate generation than mine was when I was growing up.
Mm. And I think, you know, being from a similar generation to you, Blake, I concur with you that it's easy to suppose that there's some dumbing down going on in social media, but actually, as you've just said, it's the constraints imposed by only being able to use 140 characters for one kind of message really is making every word work, which is really what a good writer wants to do. I want to ask you a question about a particular kind of literature. You know, you are a memoirist, or you have written from that perspective. But what about biographies? Because there was an occasion when D.H. Lawrence noted in his diary, "I hate my mother." And that line was a mnemonic for him to remind him to write about how the person you most love, you can also most loathe on certain occasions because you know them so well. And he went on to write about it in Sons and Lovers and other things. But subsequently, PhD students in countries I won't mention have done long theses on Lawrence's maternal loathing, something Freudian. And there was this one line that was just used by him to remind him of something. And I wonder always about biographers. And I notice you recently reviewed somebody writing a biography of Monica Jones, the woman who had a relationship with Philip Larkin. And how reliable a form of literature are other people's notes about who they are? Would you like someone to write about you from the notes you've left? What about biographies as literature, Blake?
Well, I think they're a form of literature. I look to biographies for what they say about the lives of writers, whoever it is, not for the insights into the literature, because of course they will make connections between the life of this man or woman and the books that he or she wrote. But often for me, it's simply the psychological interest in terms of the life that the biography has a value. How, as you say, you can use a tiny sentence or something from somebody's notebooks and make a huge thing of it, use it to press your thesis about them, and that can be very reductive. The interest to me in the Monica Jones story was to learn about her, stuff about her that I'd never known, and the interest in reading a biography of Philip Roth recently was to discover the enormous amount about his sex life, which wasn't really telling me about his books. It was telling me about the man, but I still would value, if we learn in the biography that Roth was a bit of a misogynist, that doesn't necessarily mean that his books are plainly misogynistic. There might be a lot more going on in them. So the obvious point is that biographies have to be nuanced, just as, and this is the only limitation I would say with social media, that social media does have a tendency to do yes or no, or, you know, good or bad, and be a bit reductive in that way. So this is a plea on behalf of complexity, nuance, subtlety.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Manuela.
Sorry, I agree completely that
Go on, Manuela.
Yeah, I agree completely that I think when having a condensed language, as Matt said, in 140 or 280, as it is now for Twitter, characters to say something, that we have those spaces where we actually exchange about those ideas and disentangle the ideas that are in there. So would you say that poetry is actually a good starting point for getting hooked on literature?
Yeah, and I think because people regard poetry as primarily self-expression, it's a very natural thing to grow out of text messages, if you like, or communicating with others, or, you know, writing in private about oneself in a diary, which is often also the way that the first writing that people do will be in a private journal. So yes, I think it's a natural relationship between, well, both one's own diaries, but also, as you say, Twitter and the self-expression of poetry.
Yeah, I think it really motivates, especially teenagers, to self-express. You said so nicely in a chapter in the book, "Stop what you're doing and read this," which I really liked. That what we produce is terrible at the beginning often, but when we start to work with the words, we can order our feelings and order our experiences. So I think it's that possibly what you mean by a therapeutic effect that literature and creative writing can have on us.
Yes, I think that's a really important point that you're making, is that it's what's cathartic is not the gushing out, it's actually the ordering of the experience into words, in articulating it, in finding a shape and a structure for it. That's what makes you feel better if you manage to do that, if you've been through some traumatic experience, and you can find the right words. And you probably won't at the beginning, and it'll probably be a terrible mess. But if you find your way through, that's a healing thing, I think.
Blake, what's taking place, do you think, in fiction? Because some people say they just like to read factual books. They like to read things that are provable, like evidence in court and so on. And they say fiction is making things up. And then a writer comes back with a defense with a line like, "I'm lying to get nearer to the truth." And that confuses the fact finder even more. And they say, "Bloody hell, you're lying. Well, then how can you get to the truth?" And it's a kind of conundrum. But what's going on in fiction that does actually, and I'm one of those people who thinks it does enable us, as you've said, to explore things, to discover things, and yet it's not factual.
It's not factual, but it does access other kinds of truth, and primarily emotional truth. I think one of the things that's going on in fiction at the moment is auto-fiction. There's a good deal of more now. This term has sort of come upon us. What used to be called the autobiographical novel, like Sons and Lovers that you mentioned, would now be called autofiction. And there's quite a lot of energy in autofiction, of people having a sort of teasing relationship with the reader about how much of this novel you're reading, which seems to be based on the life of the author, is actually true and not true. I'm a bit more, I don't know about old-fashioned, but I'm a bit more of a, there's non-fiction here and there's fiction here. If in my non-fiction, my memoirs, I wouldn't tamper with the truth, might tweak a couple of tiny things for the sake of form and structure, but I have to be honest. In a novel, I like to think I'm making things up. But yeah, both are forms of accessing some kind of truth, even if it's not factual truth.
No, thanks, Blake. Manuela, did you want to? We're coming into the last 5 minutes or so. Was there something else you wanted to ask?
Oh, many things. If we had more time. I think, well, yeah, I think when we're narrative beings, if we tell our stories, it depends whom we're talking to and in which context we tell our stories, really. And I think it's with telling our stories that we gain that consciousness of what is true to us. So you hinted at the crisis we're moving through at the moment, and that probably for a couple of years we need to, in order to recover it. For it. So what would you wish for in the future? What spaces can we create, should we create for literature, for experiencing that healing process?
Whoa, big question again. Well, personally, selfishly, I'd wish for myself to have another book out. that, you know, that I find I'm able to write things that are worth putting out there in the world. I wouldn't legislate for what kind of literature I want to read in the next few years. I don't think I want to read too many accounts of what somebody's been through with COVID. I think there's been quite a bit of that in the newspapers. I think Michael Rosen's book, if you know it, is sort of his experience of having COVID in poems he wrote. For me, is enough. No, I should probably read one or two others, but something about the way the culture is changing, this new digital age, what somebody with prophetic gifts, perhaps a little bit of where we're moving. I will want to read that because we don't really understand how much some of the things we're going through, like this current conversation being on Zoom rather than in person, is here to stay. How much things are changing forever, how much the crisis with global warming and so forth means really we are reaching an end to free travel, and that we've got so used to traveling easily around the globe that is that ending. So a lot of questions about human relationships and what we do, our activities, have been raised by over the last 18 months, and we really don't know yet how permanent these changes are, on how much we come through and resume some sort of normality. So something that encompasses all that and beyond, I would like to read.
Thanks, Blake. Before you come to your last question, Manuela, I'd like to make this my last one. And that is, you mentioned that literature, good writing, is an aid to moral values. And it's another whole topic that one could spend quite some time exploring. But I wonder about what we mean by that, and to what extent freedom of speech and saying what you like, because, you know, we're now hearing of constraints on social media about saying what you like, and what other people approve or not, how that should work in the writing of fiction. And will there be another Lady Chatterley's kind of trial? We haven't had one lately, but to what extent does saying what you like help us explore moral and ethical values?
Well, I am essentially behind freedom of expression, and you know, the crisis back at the time of the Satanic Verses, I was entirely on the side of Salman Rushdie. I wouldn't say my views have been much modified, except there is, you know, literature seems to me not something that would encompass a hate speech, that would not set out to offend. What I think of as literature has no such antagonistic purpose. It's about creating understanding. It's about improving relations between people who are unfamiliar with each other. At the same time, you know, we have to defend the rights of writers to say unpopular things. They often have. Lawrence was offending the canon of standards of the time in Lady Chatterley's Lover. And there are many people now who are offending whose offences are worth attending to. So I'm not sure how well I've answered this question, but you know, I think for writers, is for the rest of us, you know, hate speech is unacceptable. Freedom of expression has to be defended, though.
Thank you very much, Blake. Manuela.
Yeah, I wish a lot of courage to all the writers. I don't know whom to give credit to, but one described writers as seismographs of future directions and where to go to. So I wish a lot of sensitive seismographs there. You are vice president of the Royal Society of Literature and very active in the PEN Association. So my last question would be what potential you see in the collaboration and cooperation of writers and authors? Why is it important?
Well, I think that there are two things really. For writers who tend to be rather solitary creatures, things like the Royal Society of Literature or PEN have a social value of, you know, a chance to spend time with fellow practitioners to exchange thoughts and so on. But beyond that, they both have very, what I call noble purposes. Pen to defend freedom of expression, to campaign against the imprisoning of writers who've offended their regimes in some way. The Royal Society of Literature, which puts on lots of valuable events, has lots of important initiatives in schools and beyond. So they're both very important. They matter perhaps more to readers than to writers, but for writers too, they have their value.
Blake, thank you very much. Manuela, thank you very much. One of the strap lines for the Swindon Festival of Literature is Swindon Festival of Literature and Ideas. And another little slogan that we have is life is for learning at the Swindon Festival of Literature. So I'm really glad, Blake, that without me mentioning that to you, you've actually indicated that literature is something through which we can learn and discover and explore, and all these lovely words. Terrific. The Swindon Festival of Literature says, Manuela Wippenfürth, thank you very much for coming to us all the way from Austria online. Hope you'll come back and see us in person one day. But most of all, a Swindon Festival of Literature thank you to Blake Morrison. Blake, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for provoking lots of ideas for me to take away and think about.